Family disputes can make us feel isolated and vulnerable. Maybe you're going through a divorce or a legal dispute about your kids. Perhaps you've spent hours on Google or have even posted anonymously on Facebook to see what others have to say. But are you getting the actual information and support that you're looking for? Our podcast, Legal Lounge, aims to dispel misinformation and downright bad legal information to empower anyone with questions about their family, their children, their finances, their marriage, and the law. As a team focused exclusively on family law matters, we aim to help listeners not only with the information they need, but also with the hope that their situation has a solution. Short disclaimer, please note this podcast is for educational purposes only, and the information should not be relied upon as legal advice or for legal purposes. Hi, Courtney. Welcome to the Legal Lounge. We're so excited to have you on as our guest today. Tell viewers a little bit more about yourself.
Hi, thanks for having me. So I am located in New Jersey. I have two children, and I am the co-founder of New Jersey Protective Moms. I'm also the legislative chair for the Divorce Coalition, which I believe is what brought you and I together initially. And I had been listening to your podcast and reached out, and now here we are. So we can talk about, post-separation recovery and co-parenting or shared parenting with an abusive ex-partner and all things you need to do to invest in yourself after you're leaving a toxic or abusive relationship.
Yes. Thank you, Courtney, so much for being here, for reaching out to me. You just touched on it. And I think this is a very important topic for a lot of our listeners is first off, identifying that they're in a toxic relationship. And then what steps, if you could share what you did to identify it and basically get out of that toxic relationship.
Yeah, so I think for me, and I've kind of come into a lot of realizations, obviously after the relationship, but the further I get away from it, the more clear it's becoming. And the more I see people in their own situations, it's kind of giving me more and more clarity about my own, still to present day, which is fascinating because it's been 7 years. But I think I always had a nagging suspicion that something wasn't right. But I think, a marriage for most people is a new experience. Having kids for most women is a new experience, especially your first child. So you don't know exactly how that's supposed to feel in a sense. You have an idea. We have all these preconceived notions, but until you're in it and you're living it, you don't really exactly know how your partner's supposed to be, how you're supposed to feel, how the interactions between yourself and your partner are supposed to be. So as that starts to unfold in real time, and that nagging suspicion stays and you just don't feel right, and you reach out to your mom, your friend, your therapist, whomever, I feel like we tend to get a lot of feedback of, oh, that's just how they are, that's just how it is, babies make things more stressful, you guys will work it out. There's a lot of that institutional gaslighting, like people like to say now. That's the new buzzword, but there's a lot of almost reinforcing the bad behavior as what we're expected to just deal with or tolerate. So it I feel like made me stay in it a little bit longer. So it's really hard. My point is it's really hard for people to kind of identify it when they're in it because, all of those factors, like I said. But my biggest piece of advice is if it feels wrong or there's something inside of you that just your intuition, that nag, you need to really lean into that and listen to that. And then, obviously for a variety of reasons, you can't always just leave, right? You can't pick up and just go. You may have financial reasons, maybe emotionally you're not in the place. Maybe there are things you have to do before, you legally want to start the divorce, which I always say consult with an attorney about those things. But for example, in my case, I had a business that I owned. I knew I wanted to sell that business and kind of close that chapter before I started down a divorce because I knew that business would become part of the divorce. And I knew it was already going to be kind of messy enough. So I did some things while working through my emotions, I guess, of knowing that this marriage wasn't one that I wanted to stay in long term. I really had to, come to terms with that, accept that. So, there's so much emphasis on leaving, but I think there should be some emphasis and people need to understand that they need to do it on their time frame. And, just because you recognize, okay, this isn't the marriage I want, this partner's not treating me the way I want, our communication is poor, we're arguing a lot in front of the kids, any of that toxicity, if you don't want that, take the time, take the steps you need before you feel like you have to leave. There's no right or wrong answer here, unfortunately. And there's no, hard line in the sand outside of obviously like immediate danger of physical violence. Of course, that brings a whole nother set of issues for victims. But if it's, just something extremely toxic, a lot of yelling, a lot of screaming, which is what, I had, unfortunately, I found ways to kind of deal in the interim before the divorce paperwork was filed and I was able to retain a lawyer. I tried to work more. I tried to not be in the house as much. I tried to keep the kids, you know, out of it as much as I could. There were a lot of things I was doing to survive until the divorce was filed.
Yeah. And I think you touched on a really good point earlier, is that all these outside influences make you feel like you should stay in a relationship, and as you point out, institutional gaslighting. And from my perspective, looking in on separation and divorce as a family law attorney and working with people in this field, I do think at times a lot of professionals approach a marital situation assuming that both parties know how to communicate properly, both have emotional maturity, both are, healthy from a psychological, mental, and emotional standpoint. And I would beg to differ and almost argue, if they're having marital issues to begin with, then maybe that isn't the case. And so we shouldn't assume that people automatically know that they know what a healthy relationship looks like to begin with, right? Because as you said, everything's new. But on the flip side, even if you know what healthy looks like, that doesn't mean you're in a healthy situation.
Yeah, and all those factors definitely make it harder. And when you're dealing with a partner who is abusive, whether emotionally, verbally, physically, coercive control going on, or it's just extremely toxic and there's, substance abuse issues or drinking issues, it makes it that much harder because of all those other factors, right? So when that is going on within your four walls and especially when there's children involved, it's extremely difficult for survivors and moms who are looking to leave. So that's why I always say try to find a support system. It doesn't have to be extensive and huge in the beginning, but if you can find, either a therapist or a close friend or a family member that can really support and validate and listen to you, that's great because I feel like you only need one to kind of start building your strength up to take the steps you need to leave. And, start, like I said, just internally planning and looking to do things that you want to be set up when you go to leave, whether
Yeah.
that's a little bit of money in the savings account, like I said, selling a business, getting some financial affairs in order, whatever you have to do before you take that step, definitely do. Don't put this pressure on yourself because that's just going to add to the stress.
Yeah. And trust your gut.
Yeah.
It really is a unique situation to each individual, as you've pointed out. And if you start pushing yourself into an uncomfortable zone, then it could turn to even a less healthier or possibly more traumatic situation, which is not good for anyone, right? Because it really is, first off, identifying that you're in an unhealthy situation, possibly domestic violence related situation, and then figuring out the steps to get out. But to your point, it's not there's no mandatory timeline. It's on your timeline.
Right. Right. And, I started to do a lot of independent research just because I had, again, that nagging intuition and this gut that something wasn't right here and it was domestic abuse, but, there was no physical abuse in my case. So I wasn't quite sure, I didn't have a name for it then. I didn't really have like the list of behaviors that I could articulate to someone that I knew this was wrong. It was more just a generalized feeling. So I started doing, like I said, some reading. I came across Lindy Bancroft. I read Why Does He Do That? And that book really shifted my mindset and then just opened up a whole different, world of literature and changed really the trajectory of, I think, where I went in terms of what I was looking into. So that really helped give me the strength and the reassurance that, okay, I know this is not right. And like I said, social media is great and it's bad but the good is there's a ton of free resources out there. There's a lot that we can read and take in quicker than, like reading a book. For some victims, it's going to be hard to sit there with a book open in front of, a spouse if it's titled, why does he do that inside the minds of abusive and angry men? So, if you have to digest small snippets on TikTok or Instagram during the day or read something on your phone, at least, we have that available to us now.
Yeah. Yeah. Or listen to this podcast, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And literally listen to people who've gone through it and advocate for it. There's no conversation more romantic than discussing a prenup with your partner, right? Okay, maybe the song for your first dance does a bit more in the romance department. Speaking of emotions, though, the prenup is a very legal document that everyone has a very emotional reaction to. Many people avoid the prenup conversation because they feel it is an indication that the marriage will fail. But here's the truth. Half of all marriages already fail, regardless of whether the spouses had the prenup conversation or not. If you or someone you care about is getting married, would knowing what marriage involves legally be important? What about having the difficult conversations surrounding finances, career aspirations, and pursuing parenthood prior to the wedding date? If you are looking to build a solid foundation for your marriage, or you want the same for someone you care about, we are here to help you learn more about prenups from a position of knowledge, not emotion. To learn more about family law from a legal professional, book a consultation with a member of the Modern Legal team by visiting our website, emailing us, or calling us at 704-286-6302. Check out the information about Modern Legal services at modernlegalnc.com. When my mother was going through her separation and divorce in the 90s and early 2000s, there wasn't Google, there wasn't smartphones. There was a different form of knowledge sharing. And so I agree, there is a lot of information out there. On the flip side, I think we also want to be careful because some people take the information and knowledge available on Google, on websites, on Facebook, and almost depend on that as if it's legal advice or professional advice.
I've seen a lot of that, and I'm in a lot of, those groups that you mentioned, and I think they're good for empowerment, encouragement, validation, and that subset of support that those groups can bring. I think where it gets a little bit dicey is where I see people asking very case specific questions and then asking for recommendations from people who are not attorneys, people who probably don't reside in the same state and don't have the full case context because context is super important. So that is where I see it kind of posing some pitfalls or danger, right? Like I always say, I don't want to give legal advice. Well, first of all, I can't give legal advice, but I'm not going to give case specific advice, I should say, to someone that gives me a 3 sentence question in a group. So you can kind of use the knowledge that you can glean from these groups as maybe some guiding principles, like give you some insight. Oh, I want to look into that. Let me research case law in my state. Let me look up the, factors that go into child custody determinations where I live, if someone mentions that. But I wouldn't take what people say in those groups as A, legal advice, or B, a blueprint for what you want to implement in your case. Because what works for one person isn't necessarily going to work for someone else. But definitely, glean ideas from it, sure. But talk with your attorney and do your own due diligence.
I couldn't agree more. I think taking the information in and using that information to figure out the right questions to ask. Because we all have stumbled across a subject where it's like, I don't even know where to start. What questions do I even start with? And going to meet with an attorney, especially when it relates to your children, to your family, to your finances, you can get nervous, you can get overwhelmed. The whole process itself to even think about going through it can be overwhelming. So yes, utilizing those resources to kind of ground yourself, figure out the questions and information you need to ask, and clarify with a professional. is key. And I would just throw out there that there are more reliable sources than others. Generally speaking, law firm websites are a bit better than just a chat group.
Yeah, they call it, ventilation therapy, which I thought was a good term for it
Mm.
because people just go in there and just, vent, and that there is an aspect of that that is needed, but I think on the back end of that ventilation therapy, we see this, like, need for answers or people having questions and wanting reassurance in the form of legal advice, and that's where it gets a little bit tricky for me, and I try to tell people, stay away, try to steer clear of those, and also what I see is because I'll have people screenshotting me things and texting me friends of mine or other survivors that I know, getting their hopes up, and
Mm.
I not that I want to be pessimistic, but always grounded in realistic expectations, right? So you don't know how long the person's been doing that. You don't know the full context. Like I said before, people will go online and shout like, "I got this ordered and this. Is it temporary? Did you go to trial?" You just don't know. There's so many variables. So I also see that can be a detriment. It gets a lot of people's hopes up, and there can be a really big emotional like burden that comes with their bubble bursting, if you will, if it doesn't work for them.
I know it's frustrating to hear, but that's why if you happen to ask, a question to an attorney and you provide maybe two, three sentences of a family law situation, I will respond. Even in a consultation, it does depend. It depends on not only what you're telling me right now, but it'll depend on the financial documents I have to review. Maybe I'm going to depose a witness or the opposing party. And maybe it even depends on the judge we stand in front of. And I don't even know which judge we have until we file the lawsuit and get assigned a judge. All those are factors.
And even, I'm sure you'll agree to an extent, you could know the judge, but depending on that day,
Yeah.
it could be
Yeah.
it could be, that's why you always have to be very grounded in your expectations. And whenever I would go into a hearing, because I had quite a few case management conferences in my case recently, you have to have, I think, a solid foundation of what you want, and you always have to have a strategy, but within that strategy, and I always had like kind of three buckets that I focus on. I'm like, okay, where am I at now, and what's like my back door, I guess. Like I know where I'm at, so it's not going to get worse than this, right? And then what am I hoping for, and what am I willing to just be okay with if this is what
Mhm.
happens? Because I think when you go in dead set on certain outcomes, it's just setting yourself up for disappointment, because in family court, it's so hard. There's so much emotion, and I feel like, it can just change at any second from what I've found. We could go in talking about one thing and come out talking about something completely different at a case management conference. So always being fully prepared and really grounded is also super important going through the process, which is hard for victims and survivors for sure.
Yeah.
That regulation, the emotional management, which is why it's super important to focus on yourself as much as you possibly can.
Yeah, and I do want to point out to listeners, Courtney, you went through, or you're still going through this legal battle in New Jersey, but I'll reiterate the same goes in North Carolina, where yes, we will go into a court hearing expecting to focus on one thing, and suddenly the judge has something else in mind, or the opposing side brought up something that just came out of left field, and when it comes to children specifically, all of it really does need to be considered because at the end of the day, the court's going to try, and I do want to emphasize try to put the children first. But on the flip side, a judge has never lived with you and the children. The judge may never even meet a lot of the children that they then rule on custody on, and that's sometimes a very hard pill to swallow.
Yeah, and I think it's also that plays into the whole enforcement, piece that I know we briefly talked about when we first met, but it's like I'll have a lot of people coming to me and saying, I want to file a motion and I'm going to do this. One, I always say motion practice is very expensive, so just know that. And two, when you file that motion to kind of reopen the case, I always call it like you're opening Pandora's box because they can come back with really anything they want at that point, you know? So you have to really weigh the pros and cons there and really take a hard and fast look at what you're trying to, accomplish. And that's why I always say it's really important to work with a good lawyer when you're working through your divorce to get some like safeguards in place so that you don't always have to do that motion practice, whether it's a PC or some kind of alternate dispute resolution, like steps you can take before getting to the judge. And I know it's hard because it's an extra expense or it may be extra interaction with your ex that you don't want to deal with. But there is a positive, and I hate to say positive because I'll probably get a lot of people screaming, like, there's no positive in a PC, but
And
there's
a
some
PC being a
positive.
parenting coordinator, right?
Yeah.
Just for our
There's
listeners who don't know.
I just feel like there's always a positive to third party, a third party person that's gonna help. And listen, I get it, there's bad ones out there, I understand, but and no one loves a third party more than my ex-husband, who it's like a new person to, do his whole act for about how horrible I am. But I still always found a way to try to work with that person to accomplish something without going in front of the judge, because once you get in front of the judge, it opens up a whole different Pandora's box.
Yeah. And I'll touch on that from, the attorney's perspective this obviously is not legal advice, but part of the legal strategy as a family law attorney when I'm working with my clients is to recognize when we are in front of the judge actually is limited to a great extent on what they can and cannot do. The judge may not meet your kids ever. That's a limitation on the judge. The judge will not tour your house or live with you, right, for any amount of time. And that limits the ability of the judge to have a real time analysis of what children are going through. Now, the judge may bring in a therapist, may bring in all these external third parties, but at the end of the day, the judge is still constrained. And so, if we are going in front of a judge for any assistance, we need to be very calculated, very organized, and prepared, and also think through all the possible outcomes that we can at least think of. Even then, there may be a curveball.
Yeah, and to your point, the time constraint is a real thing, right? A lot of what I have dealt with and other survivors and other people in these high conflict, really litigious divorces, which we know a majority of them are domestic abuse cases, right? But a lot of those cases are quite complex, not because they're these huge complex legal matters, but because the dynamic is so domestic abuse and coercive control dynamics are multifaceted, right? There's a lot of layers there. So that takes a tremendous amount of time for people to really understand the full environment that these kids are forced to live in. So a judge doesn't really have the time to go through or take the time needed to really understand what's happening, the dynamic and the implications on the kids, right? And when you go in, it's almost he said, she said. Whereas if you have a third party that, while, yeah, it may be annoying that you have to, have another retainer with someone and possibly have a co-joint, co-parenting session or whatever the issues are that comes with that, it's going to hold more weight if you can get someone who can speak to. They can't resolve any conflict. It's always demeaning, degrading communication, even when I ask, can you stop or her to stop? I don't foresee that the prognosis is going to get better with a different third
Mhm.
party. It's always better to have something like that, even though you have to kind of suffer through to get there, than going in front of the judge and just kind of asking for something to change or griping about something, because it could quite possibly just be like the judge saying, okay, that professional didn't work, now we're going to try this. So that paper trail is important in a way where you want to get yourself set up to where you are in a place where perhaps maybe you don't have third parties anymore, but that takes a tremendous amount of time. You can get
Mhm.
there.
Those third parties, the processes are a little bit different. At least in here in North Carolina, our parenting coordinators do have pretty strict guidelines and appointment orders. So, for example, a parenting coordinator can't change a court-ordered custody arrangement, but yes, they can step in and help
clients navigate more of the intricacies. Like, if it's not good for both parents to be at the soccer game, okay, well, how about in certain weeks or for certain games, parent one goes and then you alternate with parent two and things like that.
Yeah, and if you ever have to get to the point, like I did in my case, where we went for the forensic evaluation or the best interest eval or child custody eval, whatever they call it. What do they call it in your state?
It could be a parental fitness evaluation. It could also be a custody evaluation as well.
All the same. But when you get there, most of them, since it's forensic in nature, they'll talk to any treating clinician or anyone that's been involved in your case, right? Especially if it's court ordered. So if you have, two or three or more professionals saying, yeah, conflict between them was always, paramount. They can never resolve anything. Ex husband or ex wife was really demeaning and degrading. They didn't listen to my recommendations. That's going to help that evaluator be more grounded in the recommendations that will favor you in the long run. And that's going to help, build the evidence that is needed to kind of paint that full picture for the court and really give those stronger recommendations instead of just like these soft lob recommendations. We're like, well, I don't really know. This didn't really work. Let's
Mhm.
try this. The better and the more clear the recommendations are, the better off you'll be. And it's more likely that you'll stay out of this super protracted litigation when you have those clear cut recommendations or really strong reports.
Yeah. And to that point, bringing in these third parties evaluators, um, or, we have had reunification therapists appointed and different forms of third parties get involved. To that point, the longer that third party is involved, sometimes the clearer to that third party, say the abusive spouse in a domestic violence situation becomes, because that attitude of power and control, although directed maybe only toward the other spouse during the marriage and possibly directed toward the child, may shift and be directed toward the third party. And then suddenly you have a real time witness to the power and control abuse that can testify in court.
In my case, my ex is extremely abusive to the third parties that have been involved in our case. He is inappropriate. He communicates inappropriately to their staff members, the secretaries via email or by phone, and he himself has been very, aggressive and adversarial in nature. So I've had some really good, third party witness to that, and they also spoke to the evaluator about that. But when you have adults and trained professionals that do this type of work for a living saying, I'm an adult and it was hard for me to manage how I felt in his presence or her presence, that's also extremely helpful for your case as well.
Yeah. The last thing I wanted to touch on before we ran out of time was a really good statement you said to me before, and I remember I wrote it down. Is that this whole process is not only reaching out to help from family members, maybe Google, maybe professionals, but it involves a tremendous amount of work on yourself. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think so much of my experience, and I know other survivors as well, and people in domestic abusive, relationships, we spend so much of our time trying to please our partner and make them happy and do what's best for them. And as mothers, a lot of our time is spent, taking care of our kids. So we truly become, last. And I noticed when I got out of this relationship, at first, I was spending so much time trying to, fix him or make it better, or spinning my wheels at night thinking, how can I, make this divorce better for him and how can I resolve conflict? It was kind of an exercise of utility because nothing ever made him better or made it work better. It made it worse, right? So I really took a pause and just took a really hard look at myself and what I had always wanted to do. I really wanted to get into volunteering, so I started to lean into that. I really wanted to, you know, work out more, so I started to go to the gym more frequently, but before wasn't ever allowed to leave the kids, so I couldn't go to the gym. So all of those things that I really wanted to do, I started to lean into more and more, and by proxy, I just became happier in my own home, which bleeds over onto your kids so much. And I have had so many conversations with moms where, they're so upset about shared parenting with an abusive ex or a toxic ex, and my heart breaks for them because I've been there and I know how it feels and I know how people worry, but you still have the opportunity to give your kids a happy, healthy, safe home 50% or more, or around 50% of the time, right? So that's a gift in itself because you're not living underneath that same roof with you're not sharing a roof with the abuser. So the kids aren't feeling that tense dynamic. Kids feel that. Just
Mhm.
like we feel things in our gut, kids feel things in their gut, right? So I tell people all the time, focus on yourself. Just do what makes you happy. If it's yoga, going for walks, working out, trying to stay active, eating better, doing, making fresh juices, making sourdough bread. I mean, there's Pinterest, there's TikTok, there's YouTube. There's so much you can do especially on a budget, because I get it.
Mm.
Divorce is expensive. A lot of people, you know, but going outside and walking is something that you can do for free, right? And all of those little things, like one day you'll look back and be like, oh, wow, I did that for myself. I feel better. And that in turn will make you a better mom, a better parent, a better friend. And is something that has really paid off for me tenfold more than anything else that I did, when I first was getting divorced and trying to appease my ex still. So something I always wanted to do was, help other moms. So I started, the nonprofit New Jersey Protective Moms with another survivor. And we filed the paperwork. We had to do all that stuff, which, yeah, was a time commitment and a little bit of a monetary commitment, but it was something that we wanted to do, and it makes us feel happy in it, and it gives us purpose. So I recognize that I have the freedom to do all of that now, which has really been helpful, and it's helped me show up better and in a better emotional place for, all these case management conference hearings and the custody evaluation we went through. But it's helped me so much there because I wasn't completely immersed in the conflict, and, I didn't have those feelings. So it was helpful because the evaluator was able to really see, like, I'm moving on with my life. I'm trying to make a life for myself and the kids. And my ex is very much just stuck in that conflict of the divorce from 7 years ago.
Yeah, that's huge. One last plug, just because I admire not only you, but everything you do and everything that really has changed in New Jersey specifically. Could you just tell us a little bit more about some of those legislative adjustments?
Yeah, so that's another thing, there's something powerful about reaching out to your local legislator. They're elected officials. They want to hear from us. So there's no harm in going online, looking up your local legislator and sending them an email. They may or may not write back, but you may find it really cathartic to do so. So we started reaching out to local legislators independently, my co-founder and I. And once we connected, we were like, okay, we need to join forces because two heads is better than one. And that's when we created the nonprofit. But we were reaching out to try to get coercive control passed. I obviously had started doing research, like I said. I knew about Jennifer's Law. I really wanted something like that in New Jersey where coercive control would be included in the definition of domestic abuse. So we were reaching out. I testified in front of the Senate and the legislator here in New Jersey when they had the hearing to talk through the legal wording of the law. But I found that really empowering. And it took us a while. It was a 2-year session, but we got the bill passed through. And then Governor Murphy signed it into law January 8th of 2024. So that was a huge first step here in Jersey. Yeah.
Yay.
Sadly, the New Jersey bar here was against it, but
Mhm.
we did get it pushed through. And what was really important in that law was two things. There, we got the list of behaviors that people should, really read through to identify these are coercive controlling behaviors. And that was important because, like you said, it's hard for victims to identify it. So we found that a lot of survivors said if they had the list, it would help them really understand what they were going through. And it's almost like when it's in black and white, it really solidifies it for people. It gives context and shape and words to what people have been experiencing that they haven't been able to verbalize to people. Two, we also got in there to be included if someone threatens to take custody away from you or threatens to withhold your children, that is a form of coercive control, and that was huge for us because we really wanted to make sure that we have that in there because we know it's a way that abusers weaponize children against the safe and protective parent is by that threat, right? And that's a lot of time how they keep that control over the victim because a lot of moms and parents will stay in a relationship if they're worried about that. So those were the two things we really fought hard for. They're in there. And next up, we're going to work on a version of Caden's Law, which we have been told, verbally committed to that they're going to put it up for a vote and do their best to pass it through. So I'm really excited about that. And yeah, I mean, I think we're just getting started here. So, fingers crossed, but it looks like we're finally headed in the right direction in Jersey. So I'm happy about
Uh,
that.
well, you have some fans cheering you on down here in North Carolina, so reach out if we can help. And we're definitely seeing how the law progresses in states like New Jersey. So thank you not only for being here today, but thank you for all you do, and good luck with
Thank
everything.
you.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to our discussion. To learn more about me and the Modern Legal team, go to our website, modernlegalnc.com, or check out the links in our show notes to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You can also call us at 704-286-6302. If you have been intrigued by the conversation and would like us to continue our discussions, please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review. See you next time.